A few months after the successful launch of Silent Hill 1 and being a major success for Konami in June 1999 as such tasked Team Silent, the very ragtag group that was put together to make the first game, to start production on a sequel. But being that the PlayStation 1 was going out of the door, Team had a tough decision on what next generation platform they should pick for it, made only tougher with Konami wanting them to begin quickly enough. With neither the Nintendo GameCube nor the Xbox having any real information available around them, the only possible answer became the PlayStation 2, something that pleased the business sector of Konami with their anticipation of the console, and so started the task to make a legendary sequel that would take everything from the first game and bring it to max. From evolving story concepts, early enemy designs, and trying carefully to craft the game perfectly to invoke that dire sense of fear, today we shall explore the history and beta unused content of Silent Hill 2. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button, hit the like button too to further support us and keep creating new videos. Starting the project would be very different this time, as the first game's director and writer, Keiichi Toyama, had left Konami, and therefore a grand shuffle of the staff was needed in order to produce a game that would stand up to the first game's quality. As a result, several members of the creative team from the first game took up more prominent positions, filling in the director role being Akihiro Imamura, who was the lead programmer that geniusly made the large town somehow function full 3D on the PlayStation. Though that title quickly changed as he saw the complexities of this project coming up and chose to stay as a producer instead, while assigning designer from the first game, Masashi Tsuboyama, as the game's director. Being that they already had much experience with the first game, they had an idea of how the game should look, so the focus was squarely on the writing process. Event programmer Hiroyuki Owaku was now taking up the writing of the game. He already had some experience as he more or less co-wrote it with Toyama. However, this wasn't being done completely solo, as the game's CGI director, Takayoshi Sato, was working with them on this process. Sato came up with a base story influenced from the 1866 novel Crime and Punishment, which follows the story of a poor young man who suffers from much mental and moral dilemma over the idea of killing an old female pawnbroker in order to cash in on her funds and get out of poverty, whereby after committing the crime, the boy feels much mental anguish over the guilt and horror of his actions. The story of this game as such would be around a man by the name of James Sunderland, who receives a letter from his deceased wife Mary, who supposedly died 3 years ago, in order to meet her at their special place. This special place being the town of Silent Hill, a few years after the events of the first game, whereby through the town's supernatural state, the state of one's mind manifests into real life, whether it be entire environments changing or monstrous creatures representing a reflection of oneself. Unlike the first game, where Harry Mason walked in on someone's state of mind being manifested into reality, James Sunderland's was going to be a manifestation of his own. As the game's producer, Akihiro Imamura, would state, in the first game, you're fighting an evil, but in Silent Hill 2, the character will reflect that evil. And so the writing process continued, taking that concept and writing out the scenario, while Sato assisted in writing dialogue for the female characters. With the story of the game being penned, Takayoshi Sato, aside from writing, was back to working on character design and CGI of the second game too. Having co-written the story, he was set to draw 6 characters, starting out by drawing their faces at several angles together with several expressions as a means to get a better understanding of the structures of their heads. This would follow with Sato and his team to start constructing their models with wireframes, followed by giving them a large polygonal count of 6,000. A signal of how much they were able to up that count with the shackles now removed, utilizing the power of the PlayStation 2, and eventually finalized with providing textures to the models. And so, James Sunderland was drawn, having a rather basic design, reminiscent of that of Harry Mason from the first game. In fact, it was at one point so reminiscent of Harry Mason that his original design even had the slick back hairstyle like his too, which may be the very reason they eventually gave him a more original haircut. Then there was the other male supporting character, Eddie, who was interestingly designed on the physical attributes of a friend of producer Imamura. His original design had a completely different wardrobe, with a beanie, a blue top, and gray sweatpants. Possibly was changed, as it might have not fit with his character as well as his final design does. A major theme amongst the characters were to give them all jackets originally, whereby James' deceased wife, Mary, was said to have one before losing that very jacket, also being given a different top to boot. A supporting character by the name of Angela Orozco was another character designed who also would happen to be in Silent Hill, which in contrast to James, was looking for her mother. She was also to follow suit with having a jacket as well, down to even a render of her being made with that very jacket. But soon loses that. What is interesting is how her face was a lot rounder in her initial design, but eventually made to have a much slimmer appearance to it, a means to make her look older despite being just a teenager, as a means to show the trauma her backstory was to depict, whereby she was sexually assaulted by her father. But one who received several revisions was a character by the name of Maria, a woman who looks eerily like Mary, but is in fact James' manifestation of how he desires to see Mary made real in the town of Silent Hill, which as such, she was given a rather sexually charged design, being designed initially in a one-piece dress featuring a lot of cleavage, and of course followed suit with that jacket theme too. However, her plunging neckline was giving them too many graphical problems when sculpting her model, so soon the team took what is believed to be influence of Christina Aguilera's wardrobe from the 1999 Teen Choice Awards in giving Maria a new makeover. Initially, the shirt was open, so her tube top was quite prevalent, even her hair was longer too, but soon finalized to have shorter hair and given a white top that is a bit closed with her skirt now blue. This further finalized to it all being red, closer to Aguilera's wardrobe, and her top further closed now too. Sato's vision for her was to be perfect, as she was to be a perfect version of Mary to James. While a normal person would look off at certain angles in a photo or even a video, Maria was to look perfect at any angle. But even so, he didn't want to make her too perfect, so he gave her stomach some belly flab and some brown spots on her body too, I mean to make her still seem like a real woman. Sato was so absorbed with how to depict her in a more sexier light that he started to stand in front of a mirror and pose to get her expressions down. But aside from these, the child Laura wouldn't have too large of a difference, as she started with a basic dress before giving a more kids aesthetic overall. With actual development set to begin, producer Imamura was making several preparations. Being that it was going to be a bigger game with Konami's full backing this time, Team Silent was being offered a solid 30 additional members from Konami's internal Tokyo branch for a total of 50 members, with a roughly $7 to $10 million budget, which was a norm in that era. Meanwhile, taking into consideration all the comments fans of the original game had made in order to create an even better product this time. With the abilities of the PlayStation 2, this was an exciting venture for the team, as with the first game, they had to deal with a lot of technical limitations due to the rather weaker specs of the PS1. The chains had been lifted, and many new effects were now possible. For that, serious brainstorming was taking place on how to better utilize the game to affect the human mind, planning for much disturbing imagery, whether it be enemy designs, the stories of the supporting characters, or just a shocking truth that is to come with James' story, but as well as looking back to what worked in Silent Hill 1, specifically the fog, as a means to mask the enemies for bringing about the fear of the unknown. But now with the PlayStation 2's abilities, a better handling of the iconic fog and shadow effects were in use. While fog, as usual, would have the dual purpose of masking distant, unloaded parts of the map and keeping the fear of the unknown enemies hidden behind them, the usage of actual shadows could be used to further increase the fear factor. In an example by Imamura, since it is a spotlight, the shadow on the wall gets bigger as the monster approaches you and your fear will surge. But even beyond that, bringing back the noise filter from the first game was a must to give the game a more cinematic feel. And so Billy, the game's environments were in effect and a lot more freeing this time, with not having such strict polygonal limitations in place. To begin, they looked at the game Tomb Raider as a means to better understand the crafting of a 3D world, while at the same time better working out the camera of the game in order to better view the environments, similar to how the camera would control in Super Mario 64, or so Imamura himself compared to. As a result, test rooms were being made to try out some of these new methods, such as texture mapping in what is known as Room 62. In fact, to test their capacities, the team recreated Cafe 522 with a new model for Sybil Bennett from that very game, showing what the PlayStation 2 could do and what they would use to show the public what is possible with this upcoming Silent Hill 2 game. Meanwhile, the monster and background designer from the first Silent Hill, Masahiro Ito, was back to not just do the monster designs, but be the driving force of the game's entire art direction, now considering his whole gruesome aesthetic is what gave the first game its iconic identity. Having taken influence once more from David Lynch films, but now also various other films by David Cronenberg, Alfred Hitchcock, and even Adrian Lynn's film Jacob's Ladder, he was still looking at the first game too, together with even games like Alone in the Dark for setting the environmental mood. And so this time, setting the game to take place in another part of Silent Hill, Ito was designing the town with much familiarity from the first game, including the nightmare version of the town, whereby the town flips to an even more horrific, darker version of itself, and the usage of blood, chains, and fences all around. This being something that the game's director, Masashi Tsuboyama, saw eye to eye, as he was focusing on a vision to both disturb and attract players to these very environments. As the game was taking after what the first game had set up, disgusting and broken areas were expected, and so Tsubuyama wanted to make his vision of those a reality. For that, Tsubuyama would go to rundown locations and shoot photos of various aspects of these to utilize as reference to build them in-game, which with the very first scene of the game taking place in a public washroom, he visited such a location and went on to personally model that room himself. With that room built, it served as a template for any and all future locations of the game to build upon, or at the very least the interiors. The town of Silent Hill itself was, of course, utilizing the fog to mask the distance, but as well, the idea was to also use the fog to make it seem larger than it is, while also giving it that feeling of isolation. But one idea the team had was the entry into the town itself. This was to have a very, very long pathway to get into town. The idea the team had was to give the feeling of the player not wanting to turn back, as they already had come a long way, a move the team was skeptical of, as it might bore the player on the gameplay, but took the risk anyways. The game was clearly staying apace to the first game's psychological presentation, and much of this did tie back to the game being a manifestation of protagonist James Sunderland's psyche, which to further that point to both the character and the player, the letter by Mary is included in one's inventory, and even has its text all in place. But after certain key events, the letter starts to lose its text, and then it disappears, leaving just an envelope, and eventually nothing. A means to show that the letter never even existed in the first place, and it was something James simply was making up in his mind that manifested in the town of Silent Hill. In fact, James even finds corpses in the game that are his exact self. Despite being left ambiguous to the player, on a second playthrough, this does start to become more obvious, or even finding Mary's dress randomly in one's room. And so these themes combined with the cryptic and disturbed environments all produced what were to be a feeling of isolation as a manifestation of James's mindset. And it wasn't just around James all the time. The supporting cast would have their own psyche at times affect the world around them too. One of the biggest being of Angela, where she is trapped in this room with a monster that represented her father, while simultaneously that very room was pulsating in and out to further emphasize Angela's scars of her event with her father. And so soon came time to populate the town with the characters that Takayoshi Sato had drawn up. He opted to not use motion capture for facial expressions and instead utilize 3D graphic software, Softimage, give these character models their proper set of animations. His reason being that he felt motion capture may not be able to capture expressions so well, and rather make many expressions by hand until happy with what works. This would lead to Sato further experimenting in front of a mirror to get these down. But he didn't back down from using motion capture for bodily movements, as those were pretty straightforward. Even Maria's motion capture actor struck the sexy poses he wanted, which for that, a lengthy auditioning process was underway, with over 60 people auditioning for the role, 5 of which were hired for the cast of the game as both their motion capture models and their voice actors too. Maria and Mary, of course, were played by the same actress, Monica Taylor Horgan. This all being since they both should not just sound the same, but the face also is the same too, and so the motion capture would translate well from Horgan to these two. And it was at this stage where Sato, who was also a CG artist, started to craft FMV cutscenes of the game too, one of the most well-known being a prison cell scene, whereby James meets Maria behind bars. The scene was being designed in a manner to confuse the player, as suddenly Maria's whole sexy aesthetic is toned down here, being much more homely and even being ambiguous on whether she is Maria or in fact Mary, which with Maria, she was being planned to be killed a few times over, with her spawning over and over, leaving James confused. Plans were made for her to die by the elevator entrance in the hospital, murdered on the prison bed, and impaled at the Lakeview Hotel. However, this was set to play out a bit differently. Instead of dying at the elevator entrance at the hospital, it was to happen at the prison. And during the part James was to jump down a hole in the prison, Maria was to be impaled by spikes, the latter being changed as it didn't fit the game's lore. And it wasn't just Maria who was to receive story changes, but for other characters too. Eddie was to initially be found brutally murdering a man upon James entering the room, whereby Eddie would then run to the washroom and puke. Only the part of him puking would stay. And Angela was also being planned to be encountered and even attack James in the hospital, only stopping when she sees him, her role being entirely cut from there. In fact, with James himself, the game was to open up with him in another town's gas station, asking for directions, eventually cut and just kept to the bathroom opening. But one very disturbing idea was being made for the great unveil of the game, the murder of Mary. Mary is to be unveiled via a videotape, whereby it is revealed that James choked her to death using a pillow. This was even said to have a very disturbing piece of audio of her suffocating to death. But this ultimately was cut, but the implications of her death by pillow remained. It would lead to the game having 6 endings, 4 main endings and 2 joke endings. The joke endings would be the return of the joke UFO ending from the first game, but as well as a new dog ending. Meanwhile, 4 main endings were being designed based on one's actions throughout the game, leading to a different fate for James and the cast. One notable ending is the leave ending, which is where James was to survive, accept his sorrowful actions, and leave town with Laura. This was said to be more fleshed out initially, whereby James was to also bury Mary and adopt Laura, one that might have led to a more definitive end. On the other side of the same coin, art director Masahiro Ito had been busy designing and building the monsters that were to populate within the game, very creatures that were to be a manifestation of James's psyche, going with the theme of soured flesh in designing his creatures, a means to make them look deformed and rotten while still having an element of humanity, taking heavy inspiration from the gruesome art of Francis Bacon. Initially, Ito's idea of introducing these involved making the player think these are human until you meet them face to face, and then snowballing to much more deformed creatures and seeing how different they are, having very twitchy movements, further express that, looking almost like a drunk person moving at times. Much as with Maria, these creatures were also for the most part supposed to be a manifestation of James's psyche and subconscious, which once again, like Maria, these characters were all sexually charged in a way, whereby you have the bubblehead nurse, who looks like a sexy nurse by the face of soured flesh, being in itself another manifestation of Mary in a sicker state with how much she twitches. In fact, she was initially even drawn to have a blood transfusion stand, showcasing that further, before given a simple steel pipe. Same goes for the lying figure, which is a manifestation of Mary's corpse, looking like human bodies in a body bag. As a result, initially this had a more sexual design with more human looking legs, and to together with long boots and a straitjacket, complete with a mouth that it can use to stick out its tongue and eat corpses. But soon it was just simplified to being a body bag design. The idea of these in fact came from Ito seeing a co-worker of his one day walking into the office with his hoodie on, hands in pocket, while grooving to music he was listening to, giving him the idea of the straitjacket monster. And that's the thing, a lot of these monsters became monsters based on Mary and her illness, Flesh Lips being another, as his flesh represented the broken skin of Mary, while being one of the few monsters with a mouth to represent the verbal attacks of Mary to James due to her illness. Initially drawn without a cage, but soon provided one, this being followed by the Mandarin, a monster that hangs around in the nightmare version of Silent Hill, being a representation of the anguish of Mary's illness. And as this was being set as the first monster seen after Flesh Lips, it too received these mouths on its hands too. And then there was the mannequin, who was made from 4 pairs of prosthetic legs that Mary would use during her illness. But while many of these were based on Mary, there was a much bigger enemy in the works. While the writing process was going on, the writing team wished for an idea of a character that would chase the protagonist, with its face hidden to make it look less human. But the answer already existed. Back when Silent Hill 1 was completed, Masahiro Ito had made a new enemy character, plans to use for a future entry. The character was one that would cover its face with a white cloth upon its original design, but Ito didn't like what he had made, as it simply looked like a human with a mask, and so he remade it now as a character who would wear a large pyramid-shaped helmet. The idea of this pyramid shape was to suggest sharpness and therefore pain, further cementing the fear the existence of this monster would have on the game and on the player. In fact, Pyramid Head was even being designed to appear at random locations in the very streets of Silent Hill, always keeping one on edge if he might appear. But this was eventually limited to him only appearing at certain interior locations. Possibly since he is so slow, this was deemed as pointless on the streets. And so Pyramid Head, while the primary antagonist and boss that would be faced multiple times in the game, there were also going to be several other bosses that were being made. Flesh Lips, which was mentioned earlier, Abstract Daddy, a manifestation of Angela's father, Eddie, and the final boss Mary. But Ito also had an idea for one other boss. This one was set to appear in the apartment complex, but Ito just couldn't finish its model on time, and so had to be scrapped. There is also this one other monster that was drawn to look like a box with a hole and many small legs. It's unknown if this might have been that boss or another cut enemy. Interestingly, Ito at the same time was making a small, very sexually charged 3-minute short film called Fukuro that featured a strange feminine being called Fukuro in heat with Pyramid Head, together with live figures, mannequins, and even that very same cut box monster that had a tongue coming out of that hole in the box. With the world characters and monsters all coming along well, the major piece to string them all together once more was going to be the haunting chords of sound director Akira Yamaoka. Akira Yamaoka had made a name for himself with the first game featuring a chilling and industrial soundtrack that would put anyone on edge with the fear of the unknown, and these very tracks were back in a means to continuously surprise, make someone feel uneasy, and get under one's skin. Sometimes going as far as to even use no music in some areas, just to really put someone at a suspenseful edge. To Yamaoka, silence was a sort of sound too, while simultaneously, Yamaoka was coming up with distinctly traditional scores in emotional story-paced scenes too. This distinctly being noticeable with the main theme song of the game, the theme of Laura. Played distinctly on his guitar and written at his very home in only 3 days. a song that instantly sets the mood for the game's aura of melancholy. His music, of course, was only one part of his genius, and the sound effects he produced were on a level of their own, going as far as to not wanting to repeat sound effects by making an upward of even 100 different footstep noises, while giving a very distinct and disturbing noise for the monsters. Once he straight up would program into his synthesizer to mix and produce in many variations. These very sound effects, while creepy in their own right, had the major purpose too of psychologically putting one on the edge, especially when you can't see where it's coming from, thus in combination with the game's fog just multiplying the fear of the unknown. While all this was going on, the world soon started to see and learn of the sequel to the 1999 hit, which only 1 year after, it was revealed in September 2000 at the Tokyo Game Show. Revealing a simple trailer showcasing many snippets of cutscenes from the game, kicking off the trailer with Mary's voice, giving the game's true purpose of why protagonist James is headed there to find her, followed by the iconic fog and creepy enemies to follow. All cut to the theme of Laura playing for the rest of the trailer as we see various scenes from the game, enemies, and supporting cast, while at the same time, we see the game's disturbing locations and the game's major antagonist, Pyramid Head. Publications were very intrigued by what they had seen and how creepy it felt as expected, along with feeling that the power of the PlayStation 2 had certainly benefited with building upon the first game's atmosphere. Hilariously, IGN at first thought the main character was once again going to be Harry Mason with how similar James looks, as they both share a rather neutral design. But fast forward as development continued in building the world and game, 2 years had officially passed and it was getting close to completion. And soon in May 2001, it was going to be shown off at E3, where a playable demo was at last ready. Konami, like many companies, was having their own press show to show off their new games. Near the end of their presentation, coming on stage was executive producer Gozo Kitao, producer Akihiro Imamura, and character designer Takayoshi Sato to present what was getting to be a near-complete product of Silent Hill 2. On stage, Imamura presented a playable demo of the game, showcasing the large hospital location and the new atmosphere made with the PlayStation 2's capabilities. The presentation ends with Sato showing a trailer similar to the Tokyo Game Show trailer, but soon on the show floor, the press got to try this very demo to its fullest extent, where it was stationed next to a creepy mannequin of James and Laura on top of that wall from the trailer. Eventually, it was September 25th, 2001, Silent Hill 2 released in North America, and only 2 days later in Japan, receiving high praise across the board. Next Generation magazine recommending it for anyone who wants fast action and good shivers. IGN find the graphics top-notch with its level of detail, models, and CG cutscenes. GameSpy finding a story to be so good that it is more suitable for cinema than just a video game. And all across the board, much love as always to Yamaoka's chilling soundtrack. Some did, however, feel that it wasn't as strong as the first game, but still a very solid experience, including all games, which felt it was a bit rushed in comparison to what the first game delivered, but a worthy sequel, while GameSpot felt that the expectations were too high in thinking that it would improve upon every aspect of the first game, but nevertheless, a solid game. The Resident Evil comparisons didn't stop this time either, except publications such as Eurogamer felt that Silent Hill 2 is better than any Resident Evil game, whereas Resident Evil had started at the time to appear tired, overdone, and just not scary anymore. Silent Hill 2 had filled that void, a truly strong feat to be seen as a game that can match Resident Evil in quality, a feat that led it to sell well over 1 million units in just a month's time. Silent Hill 2's popularity kept going on, soon finding itself released in Europe on November 23rd, where it got a second bonus disc that showcased the game's artwork and a documentary on its development, followed by an updated re-release on the Xbox on December 18, which got a new additional mode called Born from a Wish that features a new side story following Mary's adventure prior to meeting James in Silent Hill. That very version soon being released on the PlayStation 2 as well, known as the Poem of the Last Moment Edition in Japan, the Director's Cut in Europe, and simply being the default Greatest Hits Edition in North America, for an expanded audience to experience this new side story. A PC version would follow a year later in December 2002, which included quick saves, but was panned for its poor performance. But included with that package was also trailers of a sequel too. Many years down the line, the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 would receive an HD remaster of Silent Hill 2, packed with Silent Hill 3. Despite the up-res textures and 16:9 aspect ratio, with an option to even play the game with new voice actors, it was highly panned by fans for its many technical problems, as unfortunately, the source code for the two games had been lost, and the porting team at Hijinx Studios had to work off an alpha build. As a result, the original PlayStation 2 versions had their values go through the roof as some of the most sought-after games on the console, with many alternatively utilizing a mod for the old PC version of the game called the Enhanced Edition to fix the game's issues up and bring it to stand as the most definitive way to play the game. But in 2024, Konami once again revisited the story of James Sunderland. Developed by Bloober Team, a remake of the game was created, one that even saw character artist Masahiro Ito and composer Akira Yamaoka return. Despite initial skepticism, ultimately received high praise in bringing this legendary PlayStation 2 classic into the modern era, giving life to what had been at this point a dead franchise for well over a decade. And thank you for watching. Please hit the subscribe button for I plan to be back for more Silent Hill and other games, gaming history, and cut content soon. Hit the like button and comment below on what is your favorite way to play Silent Hill 2. So everyone, thank you for watching!